Hi, fam. It's spring break in our local school district, and I am in denial because it's already April. Holy cow. But I am so excited to be with y'all because we have the wonderful Dina Scolan, LCPC, joining us to talk all about school refusal. I'm Nicole Morris, licensed marriage and family therapist and mental health correspondent. And let me be the first to say, welcome to the family. The OCD family, that is. I am here to create a community of support for family members, spouses, partners, parents, adult children, as there may be adult words, and chosen family of OCD sufferers and their community. I've had over 22 years of experience in the mental health field, but please note that this information does not qualify or substitute as a diagnostic evaluation, therapy, or treatment, and it is presented on an as-is basis. Please follow up with a qualified mental health provider in your area regarding concerns for yourself or loved ones. Thank you for joining us today. Now, let's get started. All right. So it is spring break, and it's been kind of a crazy week, if I'm being honest. Most of my kiddos were still getting over the illness I talked about last week, as were we. And we basically just stayed at home and were pretty isolated so as to not spread this bug to anyone else. But we are all feeling much, much better now. So honestly, I'm not complaining. It feels kind of amazing to be at this point in the week. But as you'll probably hear me mention at least a couple times today, this episode is timely because we are chatting with Dina about school refusal. And even though our district is currently on break, we know, fam, that breaks from school can trigger and reinforce folks' avoidance from going to school. And so if you're one of the parents or families battling with school refusal right now, and you know that you can't bear to lose any more ground on this subject, you are in the right place, and you're with family. And I'm glad that you could join us. Now, I'm going to keep this introductory greeting pretty short and sweet this week, fam, because Dina and I have so much constructive ground to cover on this topic that I want to make sure we have all the time we need to hear all the things. So let me tell you a bit about our esteemed guest expert, and then we'll dive right in. Dina is the clinical director of the OCD Anxiety Center in Oak Brook, Illinois, which is part of the greater Chicago area here in the Midwest region of the United States. She's been a mental health professional for 29 years, working in all levels of care, and she's also a member of the International OCD Foundation, and she is trained in CBT, that's Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, ERP, that's Exposure and Response Prevention, and ACT, that's Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. If you're new to us, we do love ourselves a good acronym, so bear with us. I will try to always remember and catch people up if you're like, what is that? I don't know what that is. Dina's practice has done incredible work within their community to help provide hope and healing for a range of different struggles, including today's topic, school refusal. So one last note I'll make here is a brief trigger warning before we get started. Overall, we're concentrating our chat on primary and secondary education levels, so that's K through 12 here in the States, pre-college level. But as we get into it, particularly for some of our older students, sometimes the desperation and bargaining employed can really reach these painful and scary levels for parents and caregivers. So I want to note a trigger warning that we're going to be discussing suicidal threats and suicidal ideation, and the difference between when we are hearing shock value threats and viable safety concerns. Now, I will remind you, fam, that though we are practitioners, this isn't therapy. And so ultimately, if you find yourself confronting this type of dynamic with your child, please reach out to you or your child's mental health care professional. And in the case of an emergency, call 911 or your country's emergency code. We always encourage erring on the side of safety, fam. But Dina and I thought it was really important for us to have this chat because it does come up often enough, whether we're talking about teens or sometimes partners, that it is good to have a plan and some kind of expectation around how we can manage these types of conversations. And with that, let's get to chatting. Well, welcome back to the OCD Family Podcast, and I am just really excited today, fam, because we are really in luck. We have a wonderful, wonderful colleague and expert not only of OCD and anxiety disorders, but we're talking about a really important topic today in school refusal. And so today I'm welcoming Dina Scolan, LCPC. Thanks for coming and hanging out with us today, Dina.
Thanks for having me, Nicole. I'm excited to be here.
I'm Absolutely. I am really excited too. And this episode is really timely because Dina, as we were talking before we even recorded, for many people, unless you're running real late on your school schedule, and I know they vary, but for many people, we just wrapped up spring break. And
Mhm.
so spring break can be a lovely rest. But for folks that are already having a difficult time, maybe getting to school in the morning, even getting out of the house, spring break builds in a little bit of a buffer that feeds that avoidance. No, this feels good, not doing the thing. Like, I can't go through with going to school. School's not in session. And
Mhm.
so we're going to be talking about all things school refusal today. And I know that there are going to be so many parents and caregivers and even, behavioral aides and service community folks that are helping families that are dealing with this specific issue. And so it's exciting because as hard as it is, there is a lot of hope. And I am ready to bring that to you, fam. But first, Dina, I was telling you, I've had the pleasure of having so many of our colleagues and different professionals, researchers in our field on the podcast. And I'm always so interested how people got into the OCD field because some people have always been in it. Some people are like, I just happened into it, but I fell in love and I'm here. And so would love to know if you're open to it. What brought you into treating OCD and related disorders?
Yeah, sure. So I wouldn't say that I'm a clinician who has had full clinical lived experience with OCD,
Hmm.
but I definitely struggle, like most people, with anxiety throughout my life course. I remember being in third and fourth grade and having separation anxiety to the extent that maybe these days would be considered school refusal. I definitely made a lot of excuses not to go to school. While I was at school, the nurse knew me easily. I was going home a lot during the day. Sleepovers were very hard for me.
Yeah.
Panic attacks in college, these little sprinkles of anxiety. But I think the thing that really led me into specializing in this was I was trained back in the 90s when it was all about talk therapy and reflective listening.
Hmm.
And although I enjoyed working with people, I didn't feel like they genuinely got that much better. And I found that really frustrating. So as I started taking a couple extra classes and continuing education and stumbled into CBT and ERP, it really ignited something in me because I think it spoke to having a little bit more of a protocol and some direction in treatment. So I just was really excited at how effective it was and how effective I felt in delivering that treatment.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of grew from there.
So, just to kind of follow up on that, so you were able to get some of that ERP training even in school? Because I feel like that's pretty rare in college, let alone graduate school.
Sure. Yeah. No, actually, in my grad school, it was all the client centered Rogerian reflective listening. It was more in the after you get your license, you have to take those continuing ed credits.
Got you.
That's where I ended up getting the bulk of the CBT and ERP. And I was like, this is what's been missing
Yeah.
from the curriculum in the academia, right? Like at
Yeah.
least where I went at the time that I went.
Yes. Okay. I got you. And I will say, yeah, most of my training has come in from continuing education. And
Right.
yeah, but it's not impossible. Like if you live near Baylor or certain different other schools, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, Dr. John Abraman was doing his
Mhm.
program there. And yeah, I mean, there are abilities to get that in graduate school. But I have a friend that actually had on the podcast last year, and she was doing her dissertation on trying to get more OCD training in graduate schools because it is few and far between. Well, that's really
Mhm.
cool. So you were able to see how that structure and that protocol was helpful. And that makes a lot of sense, fam, because whether you're new with us or a return fam here, we've talked a lot about how, just even for generalized anxiety disorders, exposure therapy is one of the most well researched and positive prognosis protocols within CBT. And so often, even people, if they're going to go to, say, the doctor and look at a medication, the recommendation is often this would be best combined with CBT. And so this is really helpful. But when we come to OCD specifically, which we're not going to get in the weeds about this, but I will put links on this episode's blog, fam, and any past episodes that you would want to check out about OCD a bit more broadly, you can check out. But it's a little different in OCD because the response prevention, which is the RP of exposure and response prevention, ERP, is really necessary. And that's going to come up quite a bit for us today as we're talking about school refusal. So I know the fam's like, that is fascinating. We love that for you, Dina. I am in survival mode. So
Yeah, but also,
but also, exactly. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. And when we're thinking about school refusal, because it can be a range, right? It can look different. Can you help the fam and I understand what we mean when we're saying school refusal?
Sure. I think first it's important to start out with discussing that school refusal by itself is not in the DSM. We don't consider it its own diagnostic category. Rather, it's the behavioral manifestation of an underlying mental health issue, probably anxiety issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that's important for people to recognize that it isn't a standalone diagnosis. Rather, it's sort of a collection of behaviors
Right.
that we're talking about here. And so school refusal, you're right. It can present itself in a variety of different ways and severities. So we would use this language around people who are completely absent from school, just simply not going. And by going, I mean attending school physically, the school.
Mm-hmm.
If they were doing online school at home and they were capable and we wanted them to go to the building itself, but they were choosing online, we would still consider that school refusal.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes kids will go, but only after a pretty intense tantrum and wearing the parents down to the nub in the mornings. And so, if that's a repeated sort of thing where there's a lot of tantruming happening, even if they finally go, we would still consider that school refusal.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes kids go, but while they're there, they're really engaging in a lot of high anxiety and behaviors and texting parents, going to the nurse.
Mm-hmm.
So leaving in the middle of the day, essentially, like there, but under protest with no intent of staying, we would still think that that fits the definition for school refusal. And then inconsistent attendance would be the last one, which is essentially maybe every other day, consistently missing 3 days a week for whatever reason. So that one's a little trickier because, we hear things like, but I do go.
Right.
I just don't go every day.
Mm-hmm.
So inconsistent attendance, several times a week missing would be also school refusal.
Would you also consider if someone is perpetually tardy because they are really avoiding wanting to go, ultimately they will, or people that are ditching not for social gains, like
Clout.
like my girlfriend and I are gonna go on a walk during fifth,
Yeah.
sixth, and seventh period, but for folks that may be likely to try and duck out or that are perpetually late but still maybe there all 5 days of the week. Because in my mind, too, I think of that perpetual tardiness enough that if the
Sure.
school is sending you letters and threatening court things, I'm like, yep, that fits.
Yes. Yeah, so you bring up a really good point because, like I had mentioned, going after a significant tantrum, but I guess I didn't identify that sometimes going first thing in the morning, but then leaving midday. I imagine that would constitute as well. Usually, around those circumstances, we see it connected to a specific class,
Mhm.
whether the content of the class or the people in the class are triggering to them. It's typically the class that they're trying to avoid.
Okay, so there might be a certain subject matter. And again, this is going
Mhm.
to be more likely probably earliest middle school and depending on whether it's an open campus. Like, I want to say most of his schools growing up, he grew up in California, were open campuses where lockers were outdoors. You walked to and from different classes and different buildings. Most kids are not going to be able to leave an elementary. They're closely watched. They would have to be pretty sneaky. And if they did, somebody would be chasing them. You would
Wouldn't get
see them.
very far.
They wouldn't just disappear and you'd be like, where's Jimmy? I don't know. I don't get it, right? The security on that is a lot
Mhm.
tighter than open campuses like you would have in a high school, right? So that's a really helpful clarification. Also, we're going to be talking about OCD. And so for some folks, they might be going, okay, so if they do school online and they're refusing to go in person, but they actually are doing school, is that really school refusal or is it like a social anxiety? And it all can intertwine, right?
Yeah. So, like I'd said a little earlier, it isn't a diagnostic category all by itself. It's sort of it's the representation of an anxiety disorder. So you had said like it's not school refusal, it's social anxiety. Well, we would say that social anxiety is causing school refusal.
Yeah.
And in fact, social anxiety is one of the primary causes for school refusal. There's just, especially in those teenage years, my gosh, it's all so social. Like for that age group, it's almost more social than it is academic focused.
Right, right, right. Yeah, there can be some avoidance or there can be just different triggers. I hesitate giving too many examples, spam, because I don't want you to be like, but that's not me. Are we out of this? No, trust me. It includes everything under the sun. The brain's creative. But also, in terms of school anxiety, sometimes it can just be school anxiety. Sometimes when we're talking about OCD, there can be school anxiety because of different
Right.
intrusive thoughts or obsessional doubts. And so this is where having an evaluation can be really, really helpful. And you said something important, Dina, because I mean, you're saying lots of important things, but one thing that my brain just picked out in that too was that social anxiety can be one of the leading causes of school refusal.
Mhm.
Additionally, I think it's good to know sometimes there can be some physical things, there
Sure.
can be some medical things going on. And often anxiety can cause physical things that can be medically related. So it can get complicated. It really shines a light on the importance of a nice, thorough assessment. So, when we're thinking about somebody that's struggling with school refusal, and you might
Mhm.
even be, as a parent, if you're listening, you might be like, no, this is behavioral battle of the wills. Even
Yes.
even so, I would encourage you to get a good assessment. And what a good assessment would entail would include both that mental health component, seeing if there is some kind of underlying anxiety or other triggers there, in addition to a medical assessment.
Yeah.
Take them to their pediatrician. And I
Mhm.
will say, fam, like I know this can happen for older children too. And I'm not forgetting y'all. Y'all, my heart is there with you. But we are concentrating more on minor age children. It can happen in preschool. We're kind of thinking of K through 12, but certainly this can apply to preschool as well. So can you tell us what might be on the radar or something just for family members to be aware of if they are going to a doctor and maybe asking, "Hey, my kid's having trouble getting to school." They're saying their stomach hurts. Maybe they're literally having diarrhea, literally throwing
Sure.
up, which can still be induced by
Yeah.
anxiety, but it also could have underlying GI issues, a virus, etc. And so, if you could help share with us, what would parents want to look for or ask if they're bringing a school refusal kiddo into a
Sure.
pediatrician?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question because I think it's something like 82% of the kids who struggle with school refusal, they will present primarily with physical or somatic complaints.
Right.
And they are typically pretty vague, like my head hurts, my belly hurts. I feel like I might throw up. I just don't feel right. I'm tired, things like that. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard. I mean, we're good parents and we love our kids and we want them to be comfortable. So it's pretty easy to say, okay, stay home. Okay, you don't feel well, stay home because we think it's going to pass, but sometimes it doesn't. Right. And
Right.
so then we either have to really push the going to school or explore the idea of there being a genuine underlying physical condition. So I do think there's some value in taking your child to the pediatrician and just asking a bit for a once over, some blood work, a basic physical. I can say that I've had some experiences with patients where they're, really struggling to wake up in the morning, struggling to sleep, and after a myriad of blood tests, turns out their vitamin D is critically low, which of course causes a lot of issues with motivation and mood and energy.
Right.
So there are, right, like some low hanging fruit that we could easily treat to help get those somatic complaints resolved
Yeah.
so that they can go. But I do think a basic physical is really important. I wouldn't necessarily suggest going much further than a basic physical unless there's really ongoing evidence of a health issue. And because, like you said, Nicole, a lot of times anxiety causes this GI distress. It causes nausea
Yeah.
and frequent visits to the bathroom. So, like, you'd get stuck in this loop if you were perpetually trying to find the reason for that and had discarded anxiety
Right.
as a potential part. Yeah.
Yeah, and Dina and I, fam, we're both in the Midwest region of the United States. And I don't know, I'm sure in the Chicago area it's been even more intense, but the cold and flu season this year is, yeah, it's been intense. And it makes sense because as we're getting into more endemic phases of COVID, our bodies were less exposed to different things. And now, in addition to COVID, we have strep running rampant, we have different viruses. And so I know for my school system here locally that they're like, if you have any nausea, keep them home, right?
Hmm.
If they have thrown up, and maybe they do throw up as a trigger from their anxiety, whether it's going to school or other places, etc., then it's like, well, they're not symptom free. And
Sure.
it can be one of those things that kind of complicates things because there's some of
Mm.
these fears that are a real factor coming
Sure.
out of COVID and strep too, as we mentioned that. We've chatted about Pans and Pandas earlier on the
Mhm.
podcast this year. In fact, we're going to have a follow up with our amazing Pans and Pandas panel soon. But can we talk a little bit? This isn't going to be like a deep dive, y'all, because I'll refer you back to that episode if you're interested in learning more. But I think, Dina, you and I were talking before
Mhm.
recording about the prevalence of increase in Pans and
Yep.
Pandas case, where it can be related
Yep.
to strep infections or other viral infections. So can we just touch base on that really quickly?
Yeah, so it's not uncommon for kids who have OCD or other anxiety disorders to see a really sharp increase in their symptoms and a decrease in their functioning as the result of PANS or PANDAS, right? Like that strep virus can either cause underlying OCD that's been sort of dormant to rise to the surface and present itself maybe for the first time. It's also possible it will just exacerbate it pretty dramatically very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And so in those situations, like I feel like that one's a little bit different, right? Because I would recommend pretty strong medical intervention for that. We know
Right.
that kids on antibiotics with a little bit more of a chronic low dose for a longer period of time respond really well if
Right.
it's the strep virus. So those are circumstances where I think really seeking medical intervention for that makes sense
Yeah.
to do that. We would still want them, obviously, to return to school as soon as possible because we all know that avoidance is sort of a precursor to a really maintenance anxiety problem or avoidance problem. So we really wouldn't want that to persist for too long.
Yeah, and sometimes in those situations, and again, like you said, it get intense really quickly. If it feels like a 0 to 100 OCD
Yeah,
showed up, or little quirks that we could in hindsight go, oh, it wasn't necessarily a quirk, but these were different rituals or whatnot that were
sure.
versions of compulsion, even if they weren't interfering with the kid's life. Now there's interference, and there's almost immediately, well, not
Immediate. Yeah.
always, but almost immediately, things like school refusal and things on the
Hmm.
radar. And fam, very soon in the podcast too, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Melissa Hunt about the overlap of IBS and OCD and other related disorders. And like you're saying, Dina, the high prevalence of how people experience these somatic symptoms. And it's not to say it's just in your head. You're literally having diarrhea. You're
Yeah. Yeah.
literally having throwing up or nausea. And then you add it to something like this time of year where you could have postnasal drip because at
Sure.
least here in the
Allergies.
Midwest, allergies and the weather can't help itself. You're in the Windy City area, so
Mm.
you're no stranger to the
A lot.
allergies. I can only imagine. Yeah,
Hmm.
so those are all good things to consider. And so it's a nice idea to rule out if you are in the midst of this and you're like, I never did that. No worries. Just a helpful recommendation and suggestion. Again, this isn't therapy, this isn't treatment, but just we are brainstorming together. Fam, we're just talking and we're seeing what we can do to cross off all T's and dot all I's
Sure.
in case this might lead to some help and healing. So if you want to learn more about Pans and Pandas, you can go back and listen to past episodes, but we would encourage either way, even a general medical checkup. Okay, so getting into this, we've talked about the definition of school refusal. Overall, what is the prevalence and the course of school refusal? We've talked a little bit about one of the leading factors being that social anxiety. But if we
Sure.
can just talk a little more about what that progression typically looks like.
So some of what I've read suggests up to about 30%, some like 28 to 30% of kids will meet the criteria for school refusal at some points across their academic career. We see it be the most frequent between 5th and 12th grade. I suspect that's because there's just so much more to be anxious about, right? Our imaginations tend to grow a little bit and we have some experience behind us that maybe contributes to anxiety.
Yeah.
We see it get a little bit more tricky and complicated around a little bit like you said, when spring break is over, Christmas break is over, or summer break, those periods of transition
Yeah.
where we have avoided school, even if it was allowed by a vacation or such, we really see a sharp increase in school refusal at that time. So the course of school refusal is pretty much like any other anxiety condition, is that it tends to get worse over time if it isn't treated, because primarily, as we know, and your listeners probably are aware, avoidance of the thing we're afraid of really just maintains and perpetuates being afraid of that thing.
Right.
So until we step into it, show ourselves we can do it, we will continue to stay afraid of it. And it just reinforces all of those avoidance behaviors. So the course of it is generally that it gets worse over time. And then it becomes almost like this behavioral thing. You mentioned earlier about how parents are like, I'm not quite sure if this is a behavioral thing or a genuine mental health struggle. And I do think that over time, that line does start to blur a little bit.
Yeah, and sometimes I will hear the comment, this is just behavioral, whether it's from the teachers
Yeah.
or from parents, and I'm not trying to make a pejorative summation here, fam. But what I would say is behavior, yeah, behavior is going to be a part of it. Even if we zoom out to just broad and general cognitive behavioral therapy, we're looking at that relationship between how actions and thoughts and feelings are related to behaviors, right? And so it's all interconnected. And sometimes the encouragement I try to think of, and I get that it feels pretty dire. So it's like, okay, this is hard. But just even opening that posture a bit to understanding behavior as a form of communication. They're
Hmm.
communicating something. And
Right.
so often words like manipulation, especially as children get older, start to come up. But I also think, and I will hear this too, like they know what they're doing, right?
Hmm.
But if you got to keep in mind, if you're feeling, whether it's because of panic, OCD, social anxiety, worrying that you have something maybe like IBS that might just be rooted by
Hmm.
anxiety, but also could be rooted maybe by inflammatory bowel disease or something
Hmm.
else, then you would get why your body would want to shift into that fight, flight, or freeze. And it feels
Sure.
dire that you need to do something. So, yes, there may be some level of insight in what they're doing, but I hesitate and really encourage folks to replace that word manipulation with
Hmm.
what can we learn from it? And
Sure.
how is that functioning in this scenario? If it's functioning to keep them avoiding the
Yeah.
thing that they're afraid of, then that's telling us something. So, how can we help them bridge that gap of addressing that avoidance fear or whatever the
Sure.
basis is?
Yeah, so we do have a fair amount of parents who will say, he knows what he's doing, he's just lazy, he just doesn't want to go. And sometimes we even see within a family one parent who feels very strongly that it's a behavioral issue, and one parent who has a bigger heart and really has much more compassion for the struggle that might be underlying it. And those are particularly challenging cases, but I do hear a lot of parents who say, like, well, they're just manipulating me. And I hear that, and I might even agree with it for a second, but to your point is they're manipulating you for a reason in all likelihood, right? Like if we're going to lean into that word, okay, but then let's take a look at what's the function of that. What are they trying to manipulate? They're still trying to manipulate not having to go to school. They have just learned a certain set of behaviors or language that allows them to avoid school. So it's still them seeking avoidance. Now they have tools and the knowledge of what behaviors are most likely to let them win that battle. And so Sure, it might come across like they're manipulating you, but I still feel like I'm pretty certain there's some level of anxiety and avoidance that's lending itself to that behavior.
Yeah, and it makes sense from a natural learning model, right? Because you're
Yes.
like, if this
Yes,
helps,
exactly.
then
Yes.
I'm gonna lean into that. That seemed to work, right? And at
Right.
some point it might not work, but while it's working, it's not
I'm
broke.
gonna right. And I think that leads to a lot of outbursts and tantrums when parents do start to get involved in the treatment related to school refusal because, we're going to shift that tide a little bit and set some expectations that they go. And there's always a little bit of outrage because, well, what do you mean? This behavior has worked for me in the past. Saying this, behaving like this has won me the gift of avoidance for a long time. So now that things are shifting,
Yeah.
they really kinda don't know what to do with the new dance that's unfolding in front of them.
It's true for any of us too, right? Like, I think an analogy is a Latina, so
Sure.
they don't always land. So I usually throw it out. We'll see what happens. But let's say I'm going to work, okay?
Yeah.
And I take relatively same course to work, and there's multiple ways I can do it, but like there's no reason for me to need to change it. And maybe halfway through my trip, there is a traffic detour crew out, and there's a man kind of waving his flag and saying, go this way. And I wasn't anticipating it. It's not like they called me and they were like, P.S. on the way to work, it's going to be a little bit crowded. You might want to take another route. Unless I have something like Waze on, if you've ever heard of that app. Very helpful in bigger cities. We used to use it a lot in LA. Here, there's like a cornfield. I'm like, well, there's a couple different ways to get around that cornfield. So Waze isn't necessarily pulled up much. And if I was going to work, I might start to feel stressed because I'm like, I have to go an alternative route. I'm already
Mhm.
this far. I know alternative routes, but imagine I didn't, or imagine that would delay me enough that now I'm going to be late.
Sure.
If you're the kind of person that doesn't mind being late, you might be like, "Who cares?" I probably get overly, like, about being on time, and my late would still probably be early because I show up early. This is who I am. It's the kind of nerd I am, and, oh, well, it is what it is. But imagine the stress. So even in a situation that's not school refusal, I'm like, "Oh my
Sure.
gosh, there's a crew, and how far does this detour go? Because I could
Sure.
maybe cut through a neighborhood here or go over here,
Yeah.
but I might
Yeah.
still hit the roadblock." I'm gonna feel the stress. So naturally, I think that it makes sense when you've used something that was successful and all of a sudden it doesn't. You almost feel betrayed, right? You're like,
Yes.
"Why? What just
Yes.
did all of a sudden?"
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so it's a much more general, but it's not a loaded example. And here we can see if you add that load of all the anxiety, all
Yeah.
the somatic symptoms you may also
Sure.
be experiencing, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think the pressure you're feeling when you're trying to get to work on time is similar to what, like, a parent is feeling when they're trying to get their kid to school
sure.
because they have to get to their job. They have someplace they need to be. So there's, like, this added piece that
Yeah,
just makes everybody's emotions that much higher.
yeah. I will too. I'll just throw out just a little asterisk thought here too, as we're talking about transitions and whatnot, because I'm very open with the fam, Dina, that I have three autistic kids. And so
Mhm.
transitions are already going to be hard. Now, if someone's feeling anxious, it's not even necessarily that they're going to refuse school. So, this is not a blanket statement that says neurodivergent kids or autistic kids specifically within that are not going to be able to do this or ADHD. Because sometimes going to school is preferred. It's very routine
Sure.
and that feels
Comforting.
regulating, even if
Mhm.
I'm stressed, right? But you can imagine if someone is already experiencing school refusal, maybe they do identify as ADHD as well as being autistic, or you have a couple different complications going on, and may even feel some of those emotions even more pronounced, right, in that moment. Then that can feel like just pure panic for them.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so I will put a note out there that sometimes there can be some extra layers of complexity, whether you're autistic or not, for any given person. But also, the conversation we're going to have today can still be very effective. So, from there, we're going to go in and just really broadly overview that school refusal doesn't just show up in OCD. And just because you have OCD doesn't mean you have school refusal either.
Sure.
But what we are going to broadly go over, and then we'll specifically zoom into OCD, is how these different mental health disorders can show up with school refusal. So if you'd like to lead us through that, that would be, I think, super helpful.
Sure. Well, I'll speak to some of the more common ones that we see at my clinic. I think we'd mentioned earlier social anxiety disorder is a huge contributing factor.
Yeah.
The hallmark of it is fear of negative evaluation from others. So consider that the preteen, teenage group is already developmentally normal to have some social anxiety. So that can make school an unpleasant place regardless, but add to it a clinical anxiety disorder. And it would make sense that if we felt like we were being negatively evaluated by peers or by teachers, we would want to avoid that, right? We don't want to
Right.
get called on in class. We don't want to accidentally say the wrong thing. We certainly want to avoid giving that presentation or being involved in the group project where there's more people
Right.
to potentially evaluate us. So, social anxiety is a very big one. Another one, of course, is OCD. That's obviously the one we're going to talk about the most. And there are different subtypes of OCD, as we know, and each one has its different sort of contributing factor to why it would lend itself to school refusal. For example, contamination, right?
Right.
Like school's a really dirty place. And
Mm.
so having to share scissors or glue or the bathrooms, having to put themselves in the way of something contaminating, fear of being in a compulsion,
Yeah.
right? Where they can't get themselves out of the bathroom or can't get themselves out of their seat. I
Hmm.
once treated somebody who had a really hard time with transitioning from in the seat to out of the seat. And so that was something other people were witnessing, and that was
Hmm.
very embarrassing.
Right.
Another one we see quite commonly is emetophobia. And I know there's not a ton of people, maybe in your listening population, a little bit more so would know this, but in general, emetophobia is the fear, irrational and chronic fear of vomiting. And
Hmm.
not just like, this is a little uncomfortable for me, I don't want to. That kind of sounds like a human experience, right? But like really almost deathly afraid
Right.
of vomiting. And so the thought of being around somebody who's sniffling or coughing is very nerve wracking to these people. They'd rather avoid it. They certainly don't want to potentially vomit in front of other people. And so if their belly isn't quite right before they leave, they'd much rather stay home.
Yeah.
So emetophobia is a large contributing one. I
Yeah.
think the last one I'd highlight is panic disorder.
Hmm.
That's another of the really big ones that we see because having a panic attack comes on very suddenly, oftentimes without a whole lot of cues or triggers, right? So think of being a preteen or a young person with the starts of a panic attack, feeling very trapped. Part of the symptom cluster of having a panic attack is I need to get out, I can't catch my breath.
Right.
And so this sort of very panic physical representation, and there's a very strong urgent need to get out, get my breath, get some help. If you're sitting in science class and this starts to happen, imagine the amount of attention that would garner from teachers and peers.
Hmm.
So, again, it would make sense that maybe these kids would want just to stay home and avoid the possibility of that happening in the first place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Also, I would add on separation anxiety, which
Sure.
can show up in a myriad of different ways and sometimes can be related to even things like trauma. You can see,
Yeah.
fam, like how it's a ripple effect, right? Everything is so interconnected. And so sometimes it's multiple factors. Rarely is it just one. Rarely do we
Sure.
live in like the petri dish where it's like,
If it only were that easy.
just this one thing.
One thing.
One thing, that's it. Then it'd be good. Right. And so there can be a number of different factors.
Mhm.
And yet, I will say, no matter where we're coming from on the factors, there's hope, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
Definitely. Yes.
Yes. I love that. Also, when we're talking about any disorders, the D in disorder is how that interrupts your functioning. And so you can see how school refusal and the interruption to the school functioning is one of those big criteria areas, right? It could
Yeah.
be in just school or it could be in multiple different areas. Another thing you said too is that kind of fear of getting caught in the compulsions. But I know that some of the listeners here are going to be going, well, sometimes it's the kid has so many compulsions at home that
They
they
can't even get
can't
out the
get
door.
out of the door It's not
Yeah.
even about school. They'd love it if they
Mhm.
could get to school. They can't get in
Yeah.
and out of the house without going through sometimes hours of tireless compulsions, and it's
Mhm.
hard on everybody, and it's hard for
Yeah.
parents. I'm validating young. It's hard when you're like, "I just need to go,"
Yep.
and your loved one is sitting there like, "I can't," and it's like both Panic at the Disco that ends up feeding off of each other because 'cause you're like,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
whole house is stressed."
Yes. Especially if the parents are working and they have someplace they need to be as well, right? It's that sort of parallel process that
Right.
everybody's got something they need to be doing, but they're sort of held back by the anxiety that's present in the
Right.
room. And I do think there's something with saying we didn't mention earlier is that in general, kids with school refusal like to be going to school. They want to be going to school.
Mhm.
One thing that school refusal isn't is truancy. It isn't these kids who would rather, be smoking cigarettes under the bleachers and laughing at how they've one-upped their parents and skipped school. Like, that's not the population we're addressing here today. It's the kids who, in general, want to go to school. They want to please people. They want to achieve. They want to be successful, but they're so impacted and impaired by their condition that it makes it really hard for them to go to school. So they are equally distressed by not being able to attend school.
It's such a great point because a lot of kids just wanna please their parents, and you might be like, "Really? We've been struggling?" But a lot of kids do, and you're really speaking to some words that for new fam, I'm gonna define it here, but if you've been around for a minute, you're like, "We know these words. They're great in bingo." People are like, "That sounds fancy." But ego dystonic and ego
Yeah.
syntonic. So if I would love nothing more than to feel quote unquote normal, to just be able to get out the door, to go to school, to play with friends, and my value is to want to be able to do those things, but my fear or anxiety or disgust or avoidance overall, which again, those are just a few examples, but it can be many different things, trauma, just all sorts of things. Then their value system isn't to want to skip. It's not like the
Mhm.
Breakfast Club here, right? It's really not in line with their values. It's what we call ego dystonic. And this isn't a perfect little definition that I give for the fam, but it's as distant from who you want to be than
Mhm.
what you are. When something's in sync, which I think of the band in sync because they're all in lockstep here, then something's a bit more ego syntonic. Well, then that's in your value system. I want to be praised. I want to be a good kid. I'm afraid I'm not, but I'm also afraid of all these things because I know I'm letting you down. And now this just adds more stress, and you're stressed, and we're stressed, and it just climbs up, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a really good point that these are good kids. If your child's struggling, even if you're like, it's so severe, though, it's so severe, you guys, we promise we promise. It's so severe because if it was in their value system, they wouldn't feel
Yeah.
stressed about that, would they?
That's right.
They'd be like, "Hey,
That's right.
I got it my way." They
Mhm.
wouldn't be having this disruption in functioning in that way. They'd be like, "No, I'm cool with all this,"
Yeah, that's
right?
exactly right.
Okay, such great points. So what we're gonna talk about now is a little bit of an outline of just how that anxiety cycle functions, and
Sure.
also how avoidance makes things feel better sometimes at first, but can really become this chronic
Sure.
barrier in anxiety.
Yeah, sure. So, that anxiety cycle is present in all of the anxiety conditions. The factors or the way that they present might be slightly different, but the anxiety cycle is pretty much the same. And so we teach it as the first thing that happens is there's this anxious thought that goes off in your brain. Oh my gosh, what if they laugh at me? Oh my gosh, what if I get stuck in a compulsion at school?
Mhm,
And they can't, right? That brings on so much distress to them.
mhm,
All of the bells and whistles and alarm systems go off in our brains. This could be as a result of the thought of going to school, or like you'd said, like while they're getting ready, trying to get out of the shower, something really gets their anxiety going.
mhm,
And then it's very natural. Like, we don't like feeling anxious and out of control when our thoughts get going and our bodies get going.
mhm.
We typically, it's just in our nature, try and find something to help us feel better, whatever that thing might be. And
Right.
so then we're talking about like a compulsion or a safety behavior that will help us feel better. And so that would typically help us avoid the discomfort that the anxiety causes. And so for school refusal kids, they really have identified school as the thing. Now, that may or may not be true, right? But their
Right.
brains have identified school as the dangerous thing.
Mhm.
And so what they're doing is trying to ease that distress brought on by the idea of going to school.
Right.
So they simply avoid or escape going to school.
Yeah.
And so at the bottom of that little cycle, their anxiety is diminished and they feel better. But where this goes left is, of course, now our brain has sort of paired avoiding school is what makes me feel better. And so it becomes this cycle where we continue to lean into that same behavior because, hey, my experience tells me it makes me feel better and I don't have to do the scary thing.
Right.
So it looks like it works, right? So I always tell people, great, people with anxiety disorders are great problem solvers.
Yeah.
They think they've solved the problem, but what it's our job to show them is they've solved the wrong problem. Because if they just had a little bit more distress tolerance, if they had more strategies and skills to manage anxious situations, then they wouldn't need to continue to avoid them. They could conquer them.
Right.
And so when we continue to avoid something, unfortunately, we're denying ourselves the opportunity to learn that we can handle it, we can do hard things, and there are ways to get through this without avoiding it entirely. And so that's kind of the cycle that gets set up for most anxiety conditions, but you can understand the school refusal piece too, right? The
Yeah.
avoidance of school.
Absolutely. And one of the main reasons, too, this is the wrong problem to solve. You might be like, how do you know which problems are wrong or not? When it's a very sticky, like you said,
Mhm.
cycle, so it's like, I think of a washing machine cycle. Yeah, it repeats.
Yeah,
And avoidance, if we avoid something, we're like, don't love that for me, and I avoid it, and I get that information, and then whether I have to face it again or not, I'm not having that same thing. My body's received information, my mind's received information. I'm like, okay, well, like it or not, I'm dealing, right?
right.
That's one thing. In this scenario, though, it's not just one day. It's not just one transition to
Sure.
school. It's this
Right.
returning problem. So you're
Yeah.
right, because that allure of any compulsion, which can include that avoidance, is, well, that helped. So the
Right.
more I can do that, the more I don't have to deal with this.
Right.
And it sends a message to us that anxiety equals bad
Yeah, and dangerous,
and
and I need to
dangerous.
avoid it. Yeah,
Right.
and I need to avoid it, right.
But anxiety is a great skill. I mean, Dina, if you and I were grabbing coffee and we walked out on the sidewalk and there was a bear and I didn't feel some anxiety, it wouldn't go well, folks.
Things would not be good,
This
right?
would not be good.
Yeah,
Right?
and so I think that there's a fair amount of explanation that goes into, it isn't anxiety that's the problem, it's the way we're viewing and coping with anxiety.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the problem. To your point, we need it and want it in our lives. Want it might be a little subjective, but we need it to survive. It does good things for us. When it's attached to a real danger, it goes left and we become impaired when our brains have paired a danger signal with the sort of benign thing in our environment that is wrongly associated with danger.
Yeah, it is interesting because just like OCD, it makes a lot of terms and conditions. It's like in this scenario, it's not good. In
Mhm.
this scenario, it's good. I don't know. I'm not a giant football fan. I always love when I bring up analogies that are not necessarily in my scope. But we watched the Super Bowl this past year because we're Taylor Swift fans. No, I'm kidding. But that was a little bit why I watched.
I mean, you're not alone in that.
Right? Judge me, fam. I don't even care. But see how nice it is to get to that place. But what made the Super Bowl, from what even I can tell, what made it exciting was it was like, man, it was this close game and it was like back and forth and it was overtime and it almost went into double overtime. And it was like, is Taylor Swift's boyfriend going to win or not? And it was just all these things. I said, what can I say? But in that situation, what made
Yeah.
it a quote unquote good game was that it had the anxiety. Because
Yeah.
that anxiety was excitement and it
Yeah,
was
the emotional arousal.
passion and
Mhm.
arousal. And in that scenario, we go, oh, yeah, that can feel fun and exciting being at a concert and the person or the group or the ensemble that you're so excited to see comes on. It fills you with that feeling. And it shows how much our mental outlook on it makes a difference, because we might have something part of that way or to that level. And if we conceptualize the meaning as I'm in danger, which sometimes we should if there's a bear, but if
Sure.
it's not a bear, if it's the idea of something, your own
Yeah.
bear, your school, your contamination, whatever it is, then it's like, oh, mayday, mayday. I can't, like, we're not going to survive this if we do it. And so you would see why your child or why your loved one is doubling down and going,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it can feel like the stakes are really, really high. So when we've talked about this, Dina, you were telling me how you really have a three-pronged approach in terms of how you address this in
that's right.
treatment. And I would love for you to share with the fam what that looks like.
Yeah. So when families come to our clinic and are looking for help with school refusal, we use a three-pronged approach in that we work with the family, the school, and therapy at the same time.
Mhm.
So, the really interesting thing about the families that we work with, and as a parent myself, I completely can have some compassion and relate. Most of the parents feel like, I want my child to feel better, and then they'll go to school. That's when I will place the expectation on them that they will go to school, but they are unable to go to school right now because of their anxiety condition. And our three-pronged approach is a what would it be, like, concurrent
Yeah.
approach? So we would do them all at the same time. We believe that we need to start feeling successful and feeling efficient in order to start feeling better. So we have to start doing something different in order to start feeling something different. And so, in terms of that family component, we help families manage their house and the expectations and rewards around school
Yeah.
so that the kid can get back to school as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, we're working with the teachers or social workers at the school to help set up reasonable accommodations. I know that's a big buzzword and it
Yeah.
gets people going. We'll unpack that in a little bit, but
Yeah.
school to have some reasonable accommodations. And then the child should be going to therapy at the same time to treat the underlying anxiety condition. And so we do all of them at the same time, which is sometimes a pretty novel process, particularly for parents who sort of have that sense of things where they feel like my kid has to feel better first.
Yeah, yeah, it's such a great point. It made me think of that phrase, something akin to if you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yes.
like, or even maybe Einstein, I don't know. I'll check it, fam, and then I'll let you know if it's different. But also, the definition of crazy is doing the same thing and expecting a different result,
Something different.
right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so it does mean a change, which sometimes it's like, well, a lot of people will be like, I'll do anything. And then we start talking about the changes. It's like, accept that because that feels stressful.
Yes.
Not anything. Disclaimer, asterisk.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about what all this entails. And parents, you're doing an amazing job. If you're even listening to this podcast, chances are you had other ways that you could spend your day than talking
Yeah.
about not going to school when that's your
Yeah.
life and you're like ready to pull your hair out, right?
Yeah.
But you're here. You're already doing something different.
Sure.
So give yourself some grace. This is not a shame on you. This is not a you're the problem parent. You're just the
Yeah.
big fat
No,
problem, which is what it can feel like. The kid can say it to
I
you.
bet.
The
Hmm.
school can say it to you. The peanut gallery that nobody asked, but they are going to tell you whether you're in line at
Hmm.
Starbucks or picking an avocado. They're like, hey, here's how you're
Here's,
feeling and could do better. I mean, thanks.
here's what you're doing wrong.
Right? It's just a
Yeah.
warm hug, isn't it? A warm hug on a humid day, that is. It doesn't feel good, right? And so it's important to know, like, this is not a slam on parent at all.
Mm-mm.
You are the fact that your kid gets to school as much as they do is because of who? Because of you, because you're working with them, right? And so if you're like, but they've refused for so long, again, you're in the right place and you're not
Sure.
alone. And this isn't a shame on you. And so we're going to dive into those different three prongs a little more. So when we're talking about working with parents, can
Yeah.
we talk about what that process means? And you did talk about some of the changes. So if we're thinking just
Yeah.
more broadly about, I already feel like I've tried everything. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So Before I dive into that, I want to speak a little bit to the parents feeling badly.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to identify that until the cycle becomes apparent and we see it more clearly, the average loving, competent, intelligent parent would figure they are just helping their child through a rough patch
Mhm.
or a phase or maybe even a legitimate illness, right? If the somatic complaints are the primary reason for not wanting to go to school.
Right.
A very normal, loving, good parent would say, oh, Johnny's having a rough week, or Johnny's having a little bit of a rough time. His allergies are really bad, or whatever. We wouldn't know that there was a real problem at hand until the pattern emerged and it became impairing.
Right.
So I guess I want to sort of offer a little pass to any parent who finds themselves in the situation where they feel like, yeah, but my Johnny hasn't been going for a long time. Yeah, but it didn't start out that way. It
Yeah.
started out as you doing what you thought you needed to do to get him past a particular rough time. But now that we see it as an ongoing chronic problem, we bring a different set of eyeballs to the situation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think that's important to identify.
Well, and if Johnny hasn't been going for a long time, chances are your nervous system is fried. You're just like spent. You're exhausted. And look at you
Yes.
still here trying.
Yeah.
Like, way to go. Way
Yeah.
to go.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's where the
Mhm.
self-care of going, I haven't given up on Johnny because I work with Johnny every day, even if it
Yeah.
means he's still not at school. But sometimes
Yeah.
we just need to take a little parent break and go,
Sure.
oh, I need a Johnny free afternoon. I need a Johnny free moment. I need time to recharge my battery so that I can come back with a little more energy.
Fresh.
Right. So
Yeah.
take that self care too, because you
Mhm.
not only can you not know what you don't know, that goes for all of us. And hindsight's 2020. It's like, oh, that was the problem. Well, if you
Right?
knew that was a problem in the first place, this would be a
Yeah.
different thing. The problem
Mhm.
is comes on and builds over time as the kid not wanting to go to school because of X, Y, and Z reason. Of course, you thought that was the problem, right? That reads, give yourself some grace, take that pass, maybe a
Mhm.
spa day. Sometimes a spa day for me is like getting a dentist cleaning because if I don't have to take the kids to it, that is amazing. I
Yeah.
walk out with fresh teeth and I'm like, I had a half hour to myself, whatever it is.
Mhm.
So thank you for mentioning that. And so with the parenting then, granting and knowing that you're trying your best, thank you for loving your person. You are, you're trying your best and that
Mhm.
matters. That matters. What do we do from there?
Yeah. So the first thing we do is teach parents about that anxiety cycle that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
And we let them know that this is rooted in an anxiety condition where avoidance really seems to, quote unquote, have solved the problem for their child.
Yeah.
And so we try very hard to plug parents from the idea that it's purely a behavioral or manipulative move. Rather, it started out anyway as what they thought was a legitimate solution to a very real experiential problem for them.
Right.
And so when we teach parents that, okay, well, this is what's happening in your child, and they're avoiding it because they think this is solving the problem. But what we know through research is avoidance makes problems worse. So even though, as a very loving parent, we want to point out that maybe now that we see the pattern, we can see that we were accidentally fueling the cycle in a way that in the long run really isn't beneficial for anyone.
Mhm.
And so we teach them the concept how avoidance is the problem, not anxiety is the problem.
Mhm.
Right? We went back, let's go back to where we said, you think you're solving a problem, but you're solving the wrong problem. If it were really a solution, the problem would resolve.
Right. It
The
wouldn't
fact that
repeat.
it
Right.
wouldn't repeat. So the fact that the problem keeps repeating tells us it's either an ineffective solution or we've solved the wrong problem. And so the first part is talking to parents and helping them mentally conceptualize the problem differently.
Yeah.
And so when they see that avoidance is the problem, then we start coaching them on how to help them not let their child avoid.
Yeah. And many parents, if you're listening and you're like, but I'm trying to work on the avoidance, how do I make them do it? Like, how do I
Yeah,
not make them do it? I've been trying to not make them do it.
I know.
It's for way more.
Uh-huh.
So, what do we do for that, Dina?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where the meat and the bulk of treatment really comes in, right?
Hmm.
So, in general, most parents who come to us, they'll say things like, I've tried everything, nothing works. And so we'll dig a little deeper and say, okay, well, what is it that you've tried? And the average parent will say, well, we yell at them and we ground them and we beg them and we get on their case and they just won't do it. And it's just a big fight.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they'll say they've tried reward programs or whatever, but if it didn't work in the first few days, that was evidence to them that it didn't work.
Yeah.
But we want to, again, reconstruct a parent's conceptualization of that and say, hey, to your point, if it feels life and death, which it kind of does when you're in the throes of really high anxiety, it's going to take a very consistent, routine approach to unlocking that whole pattern. So a few days of trying something typically isn't super successful. So what we'll do is we'll help parents shift the way things are going at home.
Yeah.
And so one of the first thing is we want to set a reasonable expectation for how the child will return to school.
Mhm.
We conceptualize it like going to school is the child's job,
Mhm.
and we need to help them get to their job. So we'll set a certain expectation, and we can, like any exposure ladder, we want to make sure that we set it up for success. So it might be something small. It might be just going for 1 hour of the day. They can pick the class time that is, easiest for them to attend. Sometimes it's just driving by the school so
Right.
that they're getting familiar with that. But we'll set a small goal or expectation and then set a very strong, I call it a juicy reward for
Mm.
meeting the goal. And
Mm.
so I'll dig into that a little bit. So in general, when we have a kid with school refusal, parents have maybe not done a whole lot to change the home environment while the child is home,
Mhm.
right? So the child gets to avoid the negative, scary thing of being at school. And then when they are at home, they are hanging out in their bedroom, they're napping most of the day,
Playing
maybe
their
playing video
Xbox. Yeah.
games. Yep, yep. Maybe parents believing that they are genuinely ill are bringing them their favorite snacks and sort of
Mhm.
catering to them. And heck, who doesn't like that, right? But the conceptualization we want them to see is that's actually positively reinforcing
Mhm.
the avoidance. When you give a child something that they want, they're going to be more likely to repeat the behavior that got them the thing that they wanted.
Right.
So avoidance of school will only be further maintained.
Mhm.
So we talk to parents about removing some of those sort of secondary reinforcers, making home as boring and unrewarding as possible.
Mhm.
So, setting up the expectation that during school time, you will be doing the things that you would be allowed to do in school. You can't lay in bed at school. You can't play video games or play on your phone while you're at school. So while you're at home, you'll have access to your school work and your school textbooks, or I don't even think they use books anymore,
Yeah.
but you get the idea.
Right, right, right.
Yeah,
They could have
and
their
and so
apps, their Lexia and their Dreambox and
yeah,
all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so we sort of shift what the parent is doing at home. They
Right.
set an expectation. They make the home environment less enticing and fun, and then they offer a very juicy reward for meeting the expectation that's been set. And when we talk to parents about rewards, most of them will say, "Oh, I've tried that, it didn't work. Oh, I've tried that, it didn't work." And while I do believe that,
Mhm.
I also think there are some key elements that sometimes very loving parents sometimes miss, right? So a lot of us think of rewards like things that are in addition. Hey, if you go to school, I'll buy you a car. Sometimes they're too big. Sometimes they're too far away from the goal of what we want.
Right,
Sometimes it's things that don't motivate them.
right.
So money to a sixth grader probably doesn't matter as much. And so rather than adding something additional, we talk to parents about needing to build an internal motivation system.
Mm.
And oftentimes our kids are very comfortable with the things that they already have available to them in their lives that allows them to keep these routines.
Right.
So we strongly recommend that parents take a look at the things they're already offering their children for free that really are above and beyond the necessities of what the average parent needs to give. And so, of course, we're talking about things like access to phone, access to internet, access to video games, maybe even the high-end food or snacks that they like, bringing your child home Starbucks every day they're homesick from school kind of thing.
Mhm.
So we would talk to parents about utilizing what we already know is a very strong motivator for your child. And we attach that as a reward to meeting the expectation that's been set in terms of school attendance.
Yeah, it's such a great point, and there's a couple things that I'm thinking of. I'm always thinking with families and for myself too, different things because children respond well to a reward system anyway,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
actually adults do too.
I mean, people do,
When
right?
when do we age out of this? It's like, anybody who's been through potty training or getting
Yep.
through these different things, and it's like, I don't get an M&M every time I go to the
I
bathroom,
know, but Nicole,
right?
it's just looks different when we're adults. Like,
Right.
we go to work because the reward is the paycheck.
Yeah,
We follow the speed limit because the reward is not getting a ticket.
right,
We pay our taxes because the reward is our freedom.
right.
So it's still a reward system. It just looks a little different.
Yeah, it looks different, and so I think that's a great point. Also, another important point is you don't have to spend money to do
No.
this. So like you said, if you're already paying for monthly internet, you can change the Wi-Fi password,
Yep, that's right.
right? And you
Mm,
can say you can have extra screen time or whatnot. If you're like, maybe the Wi-Fi isn't the thing and I really don't feel comfortable adding screen time or whatnot, do you have a movie night and he or she
yeah,
gets to pick the movie? Maybe they can pick one of the menu items for the week and they have a favorite
sure.
dinner and maybe they can even help
Right.
make it. Like, it doesn't have to, because you're going to eat dinner. You can fold it into the things you're already doing. It
Already
doesn't
doing.
have to
Yeah,
be an added expense. But also, honorable mention, as it goes anytime with rewards, if you say you're going to
you have to do it.
do it. Because if you
Yeah.
don't, what they learn is this isn't even going to come. So I'm not doing this.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
it, it is so important. And so when you're looking at those goals, make it a realistic goal. If you're like, I'll get you
Exactly.
a $10 Lego set, but then you're like, they do the thing and then you're like, well, I don't get paid till next week. I can't do it.
No, exactly.
I have a empathy for you, right? You can't make money
You
appear
can't.
out of thin air, but also you don't have to promise something that costs money. You can
That's
do
right.
something that's rewarding today already
Yeah.
in the home. Yeah.
And I think that that's another reason that utilizing something you're already giving them for free is actually a really solid choice because it is less added stress to the parent and the kid. We already know, we have proof that it motivates the kid.
Yeah.
And now you mentioned added screen time. Maybe I wasn't super clear. We would remove all screen time. It isn't a matter of adding any
Yeah.
additional, right? Like the days they skip school, they get 0 screen
Yes.
time.
Yes, and I'm thinking even as a juicy reward, it might be not only getting the standard, like if they go to school or
I see.
whatever, but you could
Mhm.
add, yes, yeah, it's like not having them play the Xbox out, not having them on. You might go, but the app they need to be on. Okay, you can turn on the app on their school iPad that they can only get
Yeah.
into the app on
Yeah.
during school hours. That's no problem. Give
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because I do, there's a fair amount of people like, but he needs his phone for the internet and he needs it for this or that. And maybe that's true for some things,
yeah,
but we all know that we did just fine
yeah,
without access to some of those. And
yeah.
we were growing up. Mhm.
Technically, he doesn't even need the phone, right? Because he's home. I
Mm-mm.
is that
Right?
is that to call for an emergency from the bedroom? I mean, it
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
there. Now, what I will say is where this can get tricky and complicated, but it's still not impossible, fam, and so we're gonna address it, is some parents are like, "But I've gotta go to work," maybe, depending on the
Mm.
age, like, I have to ask my neighbor, I have to ask somebody else to come, I
Yeah.
have to drop them off at daycare. I can't go to them and be like, "You can't give them anything," and we're also not
Hmm.
saying you can't give your child anything. We're saying make the expectation in line with what the expectation is. So if the expectation is
Yeah.
school, then say, okay, well, would you like to pick a book? Would you like to do this?
Hmm.
And so what would you say to parents that are like, I have to work because rent comes whether my kid goes to
I
school or
know.
not? What
Yeah.
what do I do when I'm asking somebody else to help out? And I can't even get the kid to respond to me, let alone them. I
Yeah.
can't ask them to be like, no.
Yeah, that's really hard. My heart really goes out to these parents who are in employment situations where they punch a clock or there's someone really watching
Mhm.
what time they arrive. Because I can only imagine the amount of stress and distress that's happening on those mornings that school refusal is in the house. Really, what my recommendation would be is that we usually try and pull in an added resource, whoever that might be. Sometimes the other parent, I won't speak to gender stereotypes, but the other parent, whichever one is less likely to get pushback, sometimes we ask that they shift whatever they can in their family to make sure that that stronger willed parent is the one that's home to see the child out of school. It's not uncommon for there to be one parent that seems a little more effective at that. They're
Mhm.
just have an easier time of it. So to call in that other parent, again, maybe like an uncle or a grandparent that is maybe a little less likely to give in to some of those previous patterns or behavior that allows the child to skip school.
Yeah.
And then, as a last resort, really, we would help them develop a plan for just a certain amount of giving the child the opportunity to attend school without too much engagement. And that's something I want to get into in a minute. But if the child chooses not to meet the expectation that's been set, there's only so much any parent can do
Right.
about that. And I wouldn't want them to like over engage around that because, again, that could be accidentally reinforcing. When we pay something a lot of attention, we tend to reinforce it.
Right.
So I would instruct the parents to go to work as needed, but to maybe remove things from the house that are those sort of secondary reinforcers. So, to your point about either changing the Wi Fi password, or I've had some parents just unplug the router and put it in the car, take it with them to work because that's the best solution that they've got. I've had some parents take gaming consoles in the car, like just take it to work with them
Uh-huh.
so that the kid doesn't have access to it, but there isn't like this back and forth. That's this overengagement that's happening in the mornings.
Yeah.
And either overengagement or they have access to it because what the heck, I just need to get to work and I don't have the time to sit and argue with you. So we would try to come up with a plan that helps remove some of the higher gain reinforcers in the home.
Yeah, and it's a great point. And for some fam listening, you might go, but my co-parent does not agree with me on
Yeah.
anything. And so trying to get them on board with this, they're going to probably go the opposite direction just to be like, you're full of it. And in those situations, then you can think outside the co-parent as well. But even if communication is strained, communicate like you would for anything else that is crucial about the kid. If the kid had to go to the ER because they were having, I don't know, severe abdominal pain, and you were like, what if their appendix or whatever the thing is, tell the other co parent in that
Yeah.
situation, right?
Yeah.
So now, for
Hmm.
some fam two listening, they're going to go, my kid is so anxious. They haven't been to school more than like 3
Hmm.
days in the last 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And if I took the phone away or changed the Wi-Fi password and went to
Yeah.
work, or they didn't earn their thing at the end of the day, and I'm the
Yeah.
one that's dealing with them, and they're already extremely anxious,
Yeah.
they can really, really escalate. And that's
Sure.
scary. In fact,
Yeah.
if they feel desperate, they can go to desperate places, right? So they can scream hateful comments, they can make threats of doing things. And I think one of the most disabling threats, understandably, is if a child or a kiddo is so upset to the degree that they're like, if you do this and don't give it back, I'm going to kill myself.
Yeah.
And that is every parent's worst nightmare, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that situation, not just in school refusal, but around different mental health presentations and not just OCD, does happen upon
Yes.
occasion. And so I'm not saying it will happen. If you're like, oh my gosh, I haven't heard that yet, I'm not looking forward to it. It doesn't mean it's going to happen.
No.
But it again, if we look at the function of it, sometimes they may actually be feeling suicidal. A lot of times they're feeling so desperate that they're clawing at anything that
Sure.
might help them
Hmm.
feel some of that stabilization, quote unquote, relief. It may not even feel relieving, but the thought of not having something
That's right.
feels even worse. And so, can we talk about that for just a brief moment?
Yeah. So I think what you're talking about there, we do spend a fair amount of time talking to parents about what's called the extinction burst,
Hmm.
which is essentially because we're changing the way we're reacting to the child and we're changing the routine and expectation at home, it's natural for them to sort of be like, what the heck? This was working before. What do you mean I now have to do the super scary thing? I don't feel equipped. I don't want to. This has worked in the past. And so we usually see an exacerbation of acting out, verbal outbursts, maybe even physical outbursts, verbal threats. We typically see that increase
Hmm.
before it gets better. And so the hard part here is this is where parents will usually tell us, well, I already tried some of those strategies, they didn't work.
Uh-huh.
And what typically happens is they've stopped utilizing that while the extinction burst was still in play and didn't wait out the extinction burst, which is, I think they say about 2 weeks or so, can be up to 2 weeks or so.
Yeah.
It is exhausting to a parent
Right.
who's already been dealing with this for potentially months, right? So
Right.
I get the big ask, but in general, we would see suicidal threats as part of the extinction burst. And in fact, we would perhaps even predict for parents that this might be a tool or strategy that their school refusal child would pull out to try to get to stay home from school. So there's a couple things we would talk about with that, right? Like, I think it depends on a lot of different factors. Are we looking at a child who has struggled with suicidal ideation in the past? Are they clinically depressed? Is there self harm
Hmm.
that, we've been looking at? I think there's a certain population for which we would take that threat very seriously and potentially recommend you taking them for an assessment because there's a history of suicidality. They're at risk for other reasons. Maybe they are an impulsive person. Maybe they have access or a plan. All of that, we would recommend an assessment. The little asterisk that I would add to that, though, is if it is sort of like just a comment to get some shock value and get the parent to back off, the risk, of course, is that this will be the new language a kid uses to be able to perpetuate school refusal. So I think, it has to be something we take on a case by case basis. And if there is no risk at all, and if there's no evidence of struggle, I might suggest to a parent to not take too much heed to that statement and just continue. It's just a sign of desperation about how hard it is for them to do this.
Yeah.
So, part of how we help parents with their kids is when we're setting an expectation, it's not coming across as a militant, do this or you don't get this, and I'm tired of your crap kind of thing. It's very loving and supportive. It's very reflective upon, I see that you're struggling and I know you can do hard things. I see that you want more for yourself. I want more for you, and I'm going to help you with this.
Yeah.
And in doing that, I'm going to set this expectation.
Yeah.
And so even when they start throwing back these verbal threats or shock language or things like that, my recommendation would, at least in part, be I know that this is so scary. It makes you feel like that, but I know that you can do this. And I can't wait for you to come home so that we can celebrate together.
Yeah.
Right? Because one of the things that's really hard with school refusal is that if we go too quickly to a higher level of care, like a PHP, well, then they're, of course, removed from school. And so then that could potentially be something that's
It's
reinforcing
avoidance.
as
Yeah.
well, right? Yeah. So you want to, I think we said we tread sort of lightly in those situations to really assess for somebody who's got some history or risk factors versus somebody who's maybe just knows the thing to say to try and get the win for what they want.
Yeah, and for any fam joining that's curious, PHP, partial hospitalization program, and you could see how that could become, okay, this is a new way to avoid. However, what I will also say is there's going to be a lot of upfront communication before changes go into effect.
Yeah.
And I was talking with Dina before we were recording about how this reminds me a lot of the space program where there would be an
Yeah.
announcement, right?
That's
And the
right. That's right.
announcement is, I'm not doing this because I don't love you. I'm actually doing this because I love you so much.
Yeah.
And I realized that the way I'm responding isn't letting you know what a warrior you are and that you can
Yeah.
handle this, right? But also, I know that you're scared. I'm here for you. This isn't me not being here for you, but this is me helping you be able to get your life back.
Yeah.
And I know you can do it because even every day you've been here, it's been out of this fear and you're still surviving it. Additionally, around things like talks and threats about suicidality, too, I would also give them a warning on that, too. If they
Mhm,
say
mhm.
something like that, I would say something to the effect of, well, I can tell you're really upset right now. And again, it depends on the situation, but I can tell you're really upset right now. And I also am going to keep you safe. So if you really think you're going to hurt yourself, we can go to
Yeah,
the ER so that you can
right,
get help. And they might be
right.
like, "Ooh," especially if they're
Yeah,
like contamination. Or let me tell you, you only have to go through one
one
suicide
time.
assessment when that wasn't actually how you were feeling to be like, this wasn't fun. And it's not that it's a cruel process, it's a process in place to keep people safe. But when you realize what a to do this all became, and you're like, okay,
Mhm.
I did
Yeah,
not like the whole thing that we had to go through just because I said that. There's also that learning often that that wasn't worth it. And
sure,
so they're gonna think before they say it again because they know you're not playing. You can be like, all
sure.
right. And if
Yeah.
you're not going, I guess I'll just call 911. They'll come get you.
Mhm, mm,
Right? And I know that that sounds like a lot, but also we want them to learn that that's really important and they can say it, but
sure.
we're going to take it seriously if
Yeah,
they do, right?
yes,
And so there's also pieces of that, but generally, let's say there's a mixture of some of that is functioning to avoid and some of it is feeling a little hopeless because not even a little, a lot hopeless because the world has
yeah,
been shrinking, getting smaller, and life
that's
has
right.
been so hard. Well, then, wow, they had the courage to open the door to say, this is how hard it is. Then I'm glad
Mhm.
and we can get them the help they need so that not only can they get back to school, but they can
Sure.
be safe. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
absolutely. So when
Yeah.
we're thinking then about some of the strategies and changes
Mhm.
coming up, and you've talked a little bit about the kind of exposure hierarchy or ladder, and for any fan that's not familiar with this is very much what you were indicating earlier, Dina, when you were saying, we're going to do these little steps. It's not a shit's changing, folks, and you're going to
Yeah,
now be there like it's 40 hours a week or you're
right.
never getting the Xbox back. That's
Mhm.
not going to work. First, would it work for you? If you were like, you can never go get ice cream again, would you be like, cute, I'm an adult, I'll do my thing? Like,
Yeah.
oh, zero tolerance, nothing? Like, that's not going to work.
Mhm.
So,
Right.
what do you mean, and how do we go about setting up that exposure hierarchy around school refusal?
Yeah, great question. And in general, if I could go back for just one second, you
Yeah.
said it's very similar to the space program. It really is. And we want to help the child conceptualize it differently as well. So when I help a parent conceptualize it differently around avoidance is the problem, I oftentimes have the student present with us
Yeah.
during that time. So they are very well aware how their avoidance has contributed. So when parents start to push back, set some expectations, and really hold to them, they for themselves had the conceptualization that this is really what I need to do to get better. It might not increase their internal motivation to do it, but at least from an intellectual level, they understand why a parent is doing this. And I do think that's an important element so that it doesn't just feel like parent versus child in this power struggle that
Right.
they don't see how it's going to get them out of the hole, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So the child is typically present when we do that reconceptualization of things. And then we do a fair amount of coaching for parents about like how to say certain things like,
Mhm.
I know this is really hard for you, but the expectation is.
Mhm.
One of the things we really notice is that parents over engage with kids, particularly in the mornings around school,
Yeah.
eating, begging, bargaining, shouting, yelling. We really want parents to step back from that, set a firm expectation, and deliver what the consequence will be if they don't meet the expectation.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to lay that foundation around. There's a fair amount of it teaching a parent to disengage. You'd be surprised how little you actually need to say once you had the conversation that says, things aren't going in the direction that we want them to, Johnny. I'm learning something new, and I've learned that my behavior has maybe made things harder for you instead of making them easier for you. And for that, I apologize. And so what you're going to notice is we're going to be doing some things just a little bit differently around here. And that's because we love you and we want to convey that we believe in you and know you can do hard things. And we know school is one of those things that's been really hard.
Mhm.
And I know going back fully is probably a really big task. And I want to set it up for success. So let's talk about this speaks to the hierarchy piece of things, right? Like, let's talk about not going to school is not an option anymore. We are returning to school. Let's talk about what those steps might look like that would make it easier for you, because this is all about getting the win. This is not about the power struggle. This is about getting the win so that you can feel empowered and capable,
Yeah.
so that self-esteem increases, so that social skills increase. So we meet the child where they're at on some level.
Mhm.
We have to take a look at what it is that's kept them out of school, how long they've been out of school.
Right.
So let's say, for example, it's, oh, I don't know, a child who's got emotional contamination issues, OCD, right? Like I don't want to be near this person because, well, heck, it could be contamination, emotional contamination, whatever. If there is a certain person or topic or classmate that for right now, their OCD is just too triggering, we are okay with allowing some form of accommodation as long as it gets him to school. The
Right.
big thing, getting him to school, out of the comfort zone at home and into the school proper. So if that means he's sitting in the counselor's office reading a book and not even really doing academics,
Right.
that's fine with us. Every 3 to 4 days, we would want to increase that ask by a little bit,
Yeah.
right? Because the worry we would have is we're just setting a new baseline where avoidance is still part of the equation.
Right. Great. I don't have to do science or creative writing.
I can sit in the library all day and never have to interact with anybody,
Yeah.
right? And we wouldn't want that to be the new norm. But if that is the step that it needs, we need to take it first to just get back into the walls of the school. We absolutely will do that, even if just for a few minutes to an hour.
Yeah.
And then increasing it, right? Like one class, they can pick the preferred class. We can allow for, specialized. This is where that school component comes in a little bit, right? The 3-prong, the family, school, and therapy.
Right.
So the school can shift where they sit, can give them a pass or two to get out of class if they need it, but only short term. We really are not a huge fan of long-term accommodations that allow for exit or avoidance.
Yeah, it's a great point because what I was going to say is sometimes parents might go, well, should I advocate for an IEP or a
Yeah.
504? First of all, an IEP, once you request it in writing, I want to say this is the way it is across the board, at least in California and here in Indiana. The school has 50 days to respond. And you don't want to wait 50 days to respond. But also, like you're saying, this doesn't need to be a forever
Yeah.
change. This
Right.
is work with your school. And some schools are going to be easier to work with than others. I get that. But if the goal is, well, Jimmy's not at school at all right now, and
Mhm.
if this is getting Jimmy back to school, then we all need to be on the same page,
Yeah.
right? And it really goes to that point too that for this child to get better, it's not that we get the child better and then reintroduce them to school. They get better because they're going to school.
Because they're going to
They're
school.
facing the avoidance. They're learning how to sit with that. And over time, yes, that extinction burst can happen, folks, and it often does. But also a huge lifting of that amount
Mhm.
of distress when you realize, because often the problem is so big, you get on the other side of it. I don't know. I'm sure almost everyone's had this experience where you're like, oh, I thought that was going to be so bad. And then I got through it and it's just like, okay, well, maybe it was
This
hard.
really wasn't that
It
bad. Yeah.
wasn't as bad. Like, I was terrified of giving birth. I have 3 children. Now, I'm not going to say it was pleasant, but what I will say
Yeah.
is, I don't know, I can think back to, yeah, that was hard, but I can't even remember it. And you think
Yeah.
this is gonna be so bad in this moment, hurt so
Right.
much, whatever, like, it's gonna be hard. And yeah, you can still do hard things, but often when you get on the other side of it, you go, "Well, that wasn't nearly the thing I thought it would be."
Yeah. And that's the gift that we give the kids when we push for them to go to school.
Yeah.
They can't possibly know that yet, right? So
Right.
that's where we lean into the parents to they're going to say the child will think they simply can't cope or do it. We, of course, know that it's hard, but they can. And that is the gift we give them by setting a really firm expectation and then by backing it up with very strong rewards so that they do the thing and gain that knowledge that you're speaking of right there. Because all along, right, the avoidance has denied them
Yeah.
the experience of that knowledge.
Well, and just like the learning has taken on a life of its own, also the learning that I can do these hard things can be so, and not just can be, research shows us how powerful it is.
Sure.
And so when you consider, especially younger kids that are so concrete, it's so fun. And you know, it's probably weird to think about. You're like, this is so stressful. What do you mean it's fun? But it's fun to work with kids because you can see how dramatically kids can change because when they get it, they're not like, well, what about this situation over here? Situation over here. They're like, oh, that makes sense. Let's get rid of this fear over here because it feels
That's
exciting and
right.
empowering. Remember, their egocentric self wants to be a good
Once.
kid, wants to see friends, wants to be able to play the Xbox, all those different factors. And for those of you that have teenagers and you're like, they could give two shits if they please me on that. I will say, when we look at the development, especially the neural development of kids, the highest prevalence of neuroplasticity and being able to learn new things is the 0 to 5 years, and then in that adolescence, which is
Mhm.
part of why a lot of like drug campaigns and dare and just say
That's
no.
right.
You remember the more you know kind of commercials and stuff from
Mhm.
childhood. I'm dating myself, but that's why it's such a thing of like, we don't want you to do drugs and blow brain cells here because you're actually creating so much new learning. And so
That's right.
even if you're more abstract and you're not as concrete, those kiddos in adolescence are in one of the highest periods of brain growth they're going to
Mm.
have. And it's amazing what they can learn and how empowered their self-confidence can
Yeah.
be when they're like, this thing that I was so sure was going to be at the end of me, it was all talk. And it was such a lie, and now I get
Yeah.
to be like, I get to do what I want.
Yeah.
I literally get to do what I want. It's so empowering.
Yeah, and it's a really cool thing to watch. Like when we start this process, the kids will be sort of harumphing over, I don't want to, and you can't make me. And the parents are a little trepidatious about, I'm not sure how this is going to go, but we'll give it a shot. And we oftentimes, even in our clinic, we will pretty regularly go to the home in the mornings to help coach the parents on how to calmly interact, not over engage. There's no arguing or negotiating. It's just restating the expectation today is that you go to the library for such and such class. I know you can do it. I know this is really hard, right? And so we can help a parent not be so overengaged with it. And so it's a really cool thing as a clinician to watch that transformation, both from the parents feeling much more empowered about, oh, I can take control of my morning, when they follow through with the consequence of removing the child's number one motivator, which again is usually a device of some sort,
Right.
when they genuinely follow through with that and the child kind of feels like, well, life really takes an unwanted turn for me when I don't do this one thing. And it's not a whole day at school, it's not all of the academics, it's simply walking through the door. And so if they start to gain that mastery and confidence on the other side, like after maybe 2 weeks of them going to school, they start reintegrating socially.
Mhm.
They start having people ask for them or look for them, like, hey, where's Jimmy today? Hey, come sit with us. And they
Yeah.
start folding back into all of those things that developmentally they need during that time period. And then it kind of takes on a life of its own. And parents
Right.
really can, right? You still have to be consistent and follow through with, right, the rewards as outlined. But in general, to your point, once they get past that original hump of, oh gosh, it's really not as bad as I thought, it's really not that long until they genuinely gain a sense of mastery and are grateful that they've gotten over that hump. And it becomes much easier. You just have to prepare for that in between part.
Yeah, yeah, it's such a great point, and their buy-in and the win is so much greater than the
Yeah.
pain and the fear, and then it just becomes this really beautiful thing where the child can feel really empowered, and you can feel really empowered, and it really does speak we mentioned a little bit earlier, but to that parallel process, right? Because The child
Yes.
has you being the cheerleader, but you aren't alone too. So, in the design of your program, which is an awesome design, I wish more programs could do it, you have that coaching that
Hmm.
really is paralleling that process and cheering you on as a parent to remind you that
That's
you're
right.
not alone.
Right.
But even if your program doesn't do that, or even if you have that parent coach from your program, similar, I would imagine, again, to SPACE, which, again, if you're not familiar with SPACE, which is Parenting Anxious Children, I'll put a link to SPACE. We've done an episode on SPACE, but I'll put some links to SPACE fam over on the blog. But it really does talk about getting those cheerleaders in your life, whether it's your
Yeah.
co-parent, whether it's a best friend, your mom. And so if you're having upset, instead of engaging and getting in an argument about it, your feelings are valid. Share it with your cheerleader and
Yeah.
let them be like, you know what? You're doing an awesome job. Okay.
Hmm.
It's fine. If your cheerleader starts going like the peanut gallery, oh, yeah, you should do this different. I think your therapist is full of crap and he just needs to learn. We're being soft with him. Maybe find a different cheerleader
Yeah.
because we can recognize we'll hope that their intention is coming from the right place. It's not going to serve me in making some of the changes if I'm
Hmm.
getting it from all sides. So
Right.
find your people, and even if you can't find your person and maybe your child's in a treatment therapy, but they don't offer that parent coach, then maybe consider even your own therapist. There's no shame in it, and you're doing a really hard thing. And if you can't get an unbiased cheerleader, that's hard for any of us in life.
Of course.
We
Yeah.
all need to know someone is in our corner. And
Hmm.
so even being able to look to that person could be a great option in terms of having someone be able to cheer you on, someone that you can vent or debrief with, somebody that can remind you of what goal you're trying to achieve there with your
Sure.
kiddo.
Right. And that they too, as a parent, can do hard
Yeah,
things, right?
they can do hard things.
The parallel process is the kid is anxious and wants to avoid school and so puts up a fuss. And the parent's parallel process is I'm anxious that my kid won't go to school. I'm trying to avoid the confrontation. So I just let him not go to school.
Yeah,
Right. So, like, there's a parallel process of the parent is also doing something really hard, which is disengaging, holding to an expectation, giving rewards or withholding something the child wants. Those are all new behaviors for a parent too. So it is very much a parallel process.
yeah, and rewarding yourself then, parent, right? Yes, taxes can be a reward, but you can splurge outside of taxes and go like, you know
Mhm.
what? Maybe I'm just gonna have like, I'm gonna go and my mom and I like to craft and I'm gonna go craft with mom for a little bit
Sure. Yep.
or, whatever the thing is. And so that's totally acceptable and not even acceptable. I would encourage you to do it. We
Yeah.
need some
Required.
rewards. Yes.
Required. Yeah.
It's a need. It's not just a want. We need something to reward to say, great job getting through this. This has been hard, but you can do it. Of course, you can do it.
Mhm.
Sometimes parents are like, I don't want to reward that. That's the expectation. I get where you're coming from,
Yeah.
but really, when we're facing something big again, it'd be different if they are the Breakfast Club and they're just wanting to smoke under the
Exactly.
bleachers. This is a different kiddo. This is a different situation. And so
Yeah.
they should be rewarded for facing their fears and triumphing over this, which they certainly can. I know that we're just about at time, Dina, and I was wondering, you were saying don't get too stuck in the goal. You start off small. We want to move back towards whatever their expectation is. So if they are in a half-day kindergarten, it's to the half-day kindergarten. If it's
Hmm.
a full-day school or a partial day school and an internship or work study program that they have through high school, then it's that, right? And in addition, what frequency then do you think, what's a good amount of time to sit with a goal and what does that progression look like to get there?
Yeah. So that's a good question because, that third prong that we didn't touch on much, and that's fine because it isn't really the content for this podcast, is that the child is going through individual therapy alongside the parent doing something different at home and setting a different expectation and such, right? So, in theory, this is pretty labor intensive. There's a lot going on because the school's involved, the parents are changing things at home and the child is attending individual ERP sessions to address the actual underlying OCD that's leading to school refusal in the first place. So that timeline depending on how often they're coming in for individual therapy, right?
Hmm.
It can be something that goes relatively quickly. We do like the idea of every 4 days or so, but not on a Monday, never on a Monday, because Mondays are hard enough for school refusers. To increase that expectation by just a little bit, whether it's 10 minutes or one class time, whatever it looks like that seems reasonable for your child and your particular academic situation. So, we would really want them to make a notable progression every 4 days or so, add a new step to that exposure ladder so that we're getting to a place where eventually they're in school all day, every day, attending classes, if that's reasonable for their level of like neural development, right? If we're looking at a neurodivergent student, it might be something that looks a little bit different. They might never really be in the mainstream classes, but at least they're in the building all day. So,
Yeah.
in the long run, that's what we would hope for.
Yeah. And so getting back to what's the expectation of life. And then once we get back there, if we start to notice things, I'm just thinking in terms of like IEP and for 504s, which are different outside of the US for because we have international FAM or individualized education plans, or maybe an isolated medical other health impairment is also another one. Some of these plans that provide specific accommodations to help children access the academic curriculum, which
Sure.
if you've ever been in a meeting, it's all about that right there. So that's what we're working on. And so if you talk with the school and the kid is really scared but willing to attend for gym class, and the school says
Mhm.
something like, but that's not even academic and blah, 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 blah. It's
Right.
getting them in the door. It's more than that's happened in the last 4 weeks. Most times, most times, because the school also is getting flack legally. You're getting flack, they're getting flack.
Sure.
Everyone is a chatter and frustrated with the situation, right? And so often they're willing to at least work, especially if you go, this isn't where we're staying for a month.
That, yes.
This is, we're going to practice getting this down to a certain level or less of distress. So in
Mhm.
exposure therapy or exposure and response prevention, we often use something called a SUD scale. It's not about bubbles, but it's subjective, which is built into the name, subjective
Mhm.
units of distress. But you're basically saying 1 to 10, 1 to 100, people use different scales. How stressful is this? And when you get down to a certain number where you're like, I mean, that's manageable. A 3, a
Yeah.
2, a 1. Often, I love the younger kids especially. I'll be like, 0, I'm done with
Mm.
it. They're like, "It's not even on the scale." Great, then it tells us we're really ready to move
Yeah,
on
that's
it.
a win for us. Yeah.
Right. Sometimes, and I'm sure we've both seen this, Dina, where they can be like, "Oh, I got this fine, but I'm really nervous about the next step that I'm doing, so,
Mhm.
I'm no, no." And we
Yeah.
might, even if they have a higher set score going, "And you can do hard things." So we'll
Yeah.
go to it, and often because, again, that avoidance builds in that reinforcement that, yeah, that next thing is so much harder and scary. Even
Sure.
I don't want you to go there yet. And
Yeah.
so we gotta think about our little sponges, our little children here are gonna be like, "It must mean it's true, that I can't won't
Yeah.
be able to take it." And
Yep.
so it's that progression. As we are ending today and we're thinking, and again, we talked at the very beginning about how spring break, it's timely. Can we end maybe just whether it's spring break, a holiday break, summer break? What are some strategies that parents can do if you're like, I was just getting in a flow and then we had a break
Yeah.
and they remembered, oh, this avoidance, not having to go to school. No,
Yeah.
feels so good. What are some strategies parents can do coming out of break?
So I think it's important to, as a clinician, sort of help them understand and predict both the student and the parent that sometimes returning after a break of any duration can be a bit challenging. So we want to normalize that so they don't have this like, oh shit moment where they feel like they're back to square one.
Right.
We'd want to let them know that that's completely normal and understandable. I think it's helpful for parents and students to remind themselves like it was super hard when I first started, but the hard only lasted for a day or two. My experience tells me this is likely to be the same. The first day or two might be a challenge, but to recall on their previous experience of success to help propel them past this tiny little speed bump. It's not even a hurdle at this moment, right? It's just a bit of a speed bump. And I think giving some language to that can be helpful as well so that they can conceptualize it for what it is.
Yeah.
It's normal. It's a small speed bump. It isn't, oh crap, I'm back to having to climb this huge wall. Rather, once I get back, it's like getting on a bike, right? Like once I get back into the swing, it's much more normal and natural, much more quickly than I thought it would be. So I think those are important tools and strategies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And also, because we're just getting over the time of year that is a spring break time of year. If you're staying home from spring break and you have the ability, I mean, you could get in the car, or you could take the bus over,
Drive
play,
fast. Mhm.
drive past it, play some Uno in the parking lot, whatnot. Like, we can still be in the area. If you're like, I'm on a cruise or we're going to Puerto Vallarta, first of all, can we be friends?
Lucky
Reach,
you. Yeah.
reach out. Nicole at OCD Podcast says, just kidding. Just kidding. No, lovely, lovely for people that actually go places on spring break. I hear that happen. But what I have found, whether we're working in this area or any area with exposure and response prevention, exposure is exposure, exposure. And if we're working on one area of
Mhm.
OCD, which is rarely just rearing its head in one area, like it's only at school and nothing else, then any practice in any way is still going to have us practicing that we don't have to avoid, we can do the hard things. So if
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, but I can't eat certain foods, like I can eat a chicken nugget from McDonald's, but I can't eat it from Wendy's and this and that, then maybe you're going to be like, hey, we're going to go to Wendy's during spring break
Mhm.
one time. We can do it. Maybe we can't eat it yet, but we're going to at least go there, order, see other people that are eating there. And
Sure.
you're still in the vibe of, we don't have to live a lifestyle of avoidance. And again, it's not something that has to cost money. There could be things in your house. Maybe
Sure.
it's like, I'm afraid of going into that bathroom. And you're like, you're going to help me clean it today. And maybe just what that means is make sure it's stocked with toilet paper or whatnot. Maybe we're not starting
Something
like
easy.
digging out
Mhm.
the toilet here and cleaning it. But depending on where they're at in their process, it might be. And then we're still living that ERP lifestyle that we don't
Yes.
have to be afraid of things that scare us if it's in line with our values. We also don't have to work on stuff that literally does not relate. So if you're like, have a phobia of heights and you're like, I don't want to go skydiving, it's not like spring break's here. Let's jump out of a plane. I mean, that's not gonna impair your life, and that's not even something that would be in line then with that child, especially a young child, value system, right? But
Sure.
doing something like being able to go to a birthday party that's gonna be at Wendy's and
Right.
I can go. Whether I choose the chicken or not, I don't have to avoid it, right?
Mhm.
It's huge. And so also just being able to carry over that lifestyle and being consistent is another way that you can keep up the momentum.
Yeah. And a lot of schools actually offer like programs during or like camps, summer
Oh, yeah,
camps or
yeah.
classes through certain breaks. And so, to your point about keeping with the daily routine of going to that school, maybe for a reason that isn't academic, I think
Yeah.
that can really help ease the transitions from those kinds of breaks as well.
I love that, and I really feel like post-COVID and maybe it's cut back a little bit since shutdown days, but with inflation and the crazy prices, a lot of schools will do a free lunch for students,
Hmm.
or even if you're not a student of that school, of children school aged. And so sometimes even like, hey, go to the school, walk up with a kid, get a lunch. They're getting the positive reinforcement, they're getting the access, the practice, all of
Hmm.
that. And that's a really helpful resource because as we know, yeah, especially as kids are growing, they can eat and the costs are crazy right now.
It's
So
crazy.
these
Hmm.
are all really good ideas. I just want to thank you for coming in today. This was so fantastic.
Very
And
welcome.
yes, and I think that if anything else, there's hope for families. And so I really appreciate all the expertise and great brainstorming and different ideas you've been able to add. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Intrusive Thoughts. Oh, Dina was a wellspring of information, and I know this was a little longer of an episode, but it's such an important topic. And I suspect that we'll have a few newcomers joining us today just for this topic. So, another special thanks to her for her thorough and compassionate sharing. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you, Dina, and we'll have to do it again sometime. And that brings us to my intrusive thought segment, which is my application segment of the show for any new fam joining us. It's that opportunity to take what we've heard and what we've learned and figure out a way to apply it right here, right now, this week. And so for today's application, here's my charge to you. Remember when Dina helped us frame that we're tackling the wrong problem if we're just targeting the anxiety and trying to make that go away? We need to target the avoidance. And in fact, I feel really proud to share that it was indeed Albert Einstein who said, and I quote, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results," end quote. Now, I'm not calling anyone crazy here, but it is crazy amazing to consider how much tackling avoidance can create new learning in the brain. So whether you are joining us today just to learn, or if you're here because school refusal is the thing rocking your life at present, I want to challenge you to choose something that you've been avoiding in your life and to take a step toward it. And we can start small. This isn't working that avoidance like it's your job. So if school refusal is the thing for you and you're like, you know what? I heard those 3 prongs. I don't have any of those prongs going on right now. Consider maybe even looking for a provider in your area or arranging a chat with the school or seeing what you can do. Maybe even talking to your kid and saying, I'm not sure how this is going to look yet, but I realize you're strong and I'm strong and we can do this. Maybe it's you finding your cheerleader or facing some big feelings that you have been avoiding because you're worried about how your loved one is going to react. For me, my OCD loves to show up in the car, especially if I've been stressed or feeling subpar. Hello, we've been sick for about a week or two. And though I'm over the sickness at this point, I am ready to bust out of isolation here. But going for a joyride in the car is hardly my idea of a good time. And while I'm not avoiding the car anymore, we made a lot of progress over time with this. Targeting the importance of facing hard things is still a good practice. So while I could enjoy myself in many different ways, I can still choose to get in the car, have no specific place to go, but just drive. And you know what? I might just surprise myself regarding how nice that feels. Just getting out of the house, even in the car. So look around. Think about the things that you may be avoiding. Getting started on a task because it feels like a mountain and just too much work? Have you avoided talking to someone you love to resolve a conflict? There's no task too big or too small, fam. We're just practicing facing it. Because when we live that life of leaning in, we don't have to be afraid of the anxiety. Anxiety isn't the enemy. It's not actually the problem. What? And often the anxiety loses a lot of its fizz when we realize it was mostly bark and not even a little bite. But what I can tell you from my personal experience in life is even when life does bite, rarely is it the big, bad, terrible something I thought it might be. And even if it was a hard thing, it still wasn't what my mind told me it will be. It didn't crush me. And in the process of finding that sort of thing out, fam, we can experience freedom that we maybe didn't even realize was possible. So join me, fam. Just like these heroic kiddos that are facing their fears and their struggles and getting back to school. Because not only are we not alone in this, but we're strong. And you and me, we've got this. Thank you for joining me and our OCD family community. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please like and subscribe to the OCD Family Podcast wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Did you find this content helpful? Please consider leaving a review. The more people that know they're not alone, the better. For more information regarding today's podcast, please visit OCDFamilyPodcast.com and remember to join the email list while you're there. It will provide you with the most up-to-date information, resources, and the down low on the family chatter. Oh yeah, nothing says family like Dina and me talking about our ability to be free. That's right, I went there. And you can too at OCDFamilyPodcast.com.